The girl with the baby. The early morning air was thick with a biting chill, the kind that settled into bones and lingered in the breath of those who dared step outside before the sun had fully claimed the sky. The world outside St. Augustine Hospital was still waking up, the road slick with a thin layer of frost as headlights pierced through the dim glow of streetlights. Inside the hospital, the hum of the heating system mixed with the quiet shuffle of nurses beginning their rounds. The sterile scent of disinfectant clung to the air, blending with the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee from the break room. Behind the front desk, Margaret Ellison, a seasoned receptionist with graying hair and reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, was reviewing patient files, her fingers deftly flipping through pages as she noted down appointment times. Her years in the hospital had made her a master of routine, but her sharp instincts rarely let anything unusual slip past her attention. The automatic doors slid open with a mechanical whisper, and a figure stepped inside. Margaret barely glanced up at first, expecting a weary mother or an early appointment, but something about the hesitant footsteps made her look twice. A small girl stood just beyond the threshold, her oversized hoodie swallowing her frail frame. Her sneakers, worn and scuffed, left faint, wet marks on the pristine floor, the last traces of the damp pavement outside. But it wasn't her ragged appearance that made Margaret straighten in her chair. It was the bundle clutched tightly against her chest. Wrapped in an old, slightly frayed blanket, the bundle barely moved, yet the protective way the girl held it left no doubt about what it contained. Margaret's heart tightened. A baby. She studied the girl's face carefully. The child couldn't have been more than 12. Her brown hair was tangled and unbrushed, strands escaping from the hood that barely shielded her from the cold. Her pale cheeks were streaked with dried tears, and her lips pressed together in a thin, nervous line. "Sweetheart," Margaret said, her voice gentle but firm, "are you lost?" The girl shook her head quickly, her grip tightening on the baby as though afraid someone would take it from her. Margaret exchanged a glance with Dr. Evelyn Carter, who had just walked up behind the desk. A pediatrician with over 15 years of experience, Dr. Carter was known for her sharp mind and warm approach with children. She caught sight of the girl and the bundle, her medical instincts kicking in immediately. "Hi there," Dr. Carter said, crouching slightly to the girl's level, keeping her voice soft. "My name is Dr. Carter. What's yours?" The girl hesitated. "Naomi," she whispered, barely audible. Dr. Carter's eyes flicked to the bundle in Naomi's arms. "Naomi, is that a baby you're holding?" Naomi swallowed hard and nodded. Her face, already pale, seemed to lose what little color remained. I found him," she stammered, her voice trembling. "Outside my house." Margaret and Dr. Carter exchanged another glance, this one filled with silent understanding. "All right, Naomi," Dr. Carter said gently. "Let's get you somewhere warm and quiet. We can check on the baby together, okay?" Naomi hesitated again, her arms tightening around the baby as though unsure if she could trust them. But something in Dr. Carter's calm expression must have reassured her, because she gave a small, reluctant nod. A nurse, who had been observing from a few feet away, quickly stepped forward and guided Naomi toward the pediatric wing. Her sneakers squeaked softly against the polished floor as she moved, her steps slow and careful, as if afraid of jolting the tiny life in her arms. Inside the examination room, the warm lighting contrasted the clinical white walls. A cushioned bench lined one side, and an infant's bassinet sat nearby, ready for use. Dr. Carter motioned for Naomi to sit in one of the chairs. Naomi lowered herself onto the seat, still clutching the bundle. Dr. Carter crouched in front of her again, her eyes warm and steady. "Naomi, can I take a look at the baby? Just to make sure he's okay." Naomi hesitated but eventually gave a small nod. Carefully, she loosened the blanket, revealing the tiny, fragile form of a newborn. Dr. Carter drew in a sharp breath. The baby was incredibly small, his skin slightly tinged with an unhealthy pallor. His tiny fingers twitched, but he barely made a sound, his breaths shallow. "How long have you had him?" Dr. Carter asked, keeping her voice calm even as her medical instincts screamed at her to act fast. Naomi bit her lip. "Since last night," she admitted. "He was outside my house. He was crying at first, but then he got really quiet. Her voice broke, her eyes filling with tears. I didn't know what to do." Margaret, standing near the door, felt a lump rise in her throat. A 12-year-old girl had spent the night caring for a newborn, not knowing if he was okay, not knowing what to do. Dr. Carter nodded, her expression understanding. "You did the right thing bringing him here, Naomi. Now, let's make sure he's all right." She turned to the nurse. "We need a neonatal team in here now. This baby is premature, possibly hypothermic." The nurse nodded and hurried out. Naomi's grip on the blanket trembled. "Is he going to be okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Carter placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll do everything we can." Within minutes, a team of doctors and nurses flooded the room, their movements swift but careful. They placed the baby in the bassinet, attaching tiny monitors to his chest and wrapping him in a thermal blanket to raise his temperature. As they worked, Dr. Carter turned her attention back to Naomi. "Can you tell me more about how you found him? Was there anyone else around?" Naomi looked down, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her hoodie. "No," she whispered. "Just him. He was in a basket outside our building. I didn't want to leave him out there." Margaret's heart clenched. "You were very brave to take care of him," she said softly. But as she watched Naomi's downcast expression, a nagging feeling settled in her stomach. Something wasn't adding up. Dr. Carter seemed to sense it too. "Naomi," she said gently, "is there something you're not telling us?" Naomi's hands tightened into fists. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, in a voice so small it was almost lost beneath the beeping monitors, she whispered, "He's not just some baby I found." Silence filled the room. Margaret and Dr. Carter exchanged a glance. Dr. Carter's voice remained steady. "Naomi, whose baby is he?" Naomi's eyes, filled with fear and something else, something deeper, met hers. And then she whispered the words that changed everything. "He's mine." The truth unraveled. The room stood frozen in stunned silence. The quiet hum of machines monitoring the baby's fragile breaths was the only sound breaking the stillness. Dr. Carter, who had spent years diagnosing the most complicated medical cases, found herself momentarily at a loss for words. Margaret's fingers tightened around the edge of the desk she was leaning against, her mind racing. A 12-year-old girl. A newborn baby. And Naomi had just said the unthinkable. "He's mine," Naomi had whispered, her voice trembling but firm. Dr. Carter's professional instincts kicked in quickly. Naomi was only 12. Biologically, it was possible but incredibly rare for her to have a child. There had to be more to this story. "Naomi," she said gently, lowering herself to the girl's eye level. "What do you mean? Are you saying you gave birth to this baby?" Naomi's hands, still trembling, clutched at the fabric of her hoodie, her gaze darting away. She hesitated, her breath hitching. "No, but he's still mine." Margaret's heart twisted. There was something deeper here, something hidden beneath the layers of fear in Naomi's eyes. Dr. Carter softened her voice even further. "Sweetheart, I know this is scary, but we need to understand. If this baby is yours, we need to make sure both of you are safe. Can you help us understand what happened?" Naomi glanced toward the bassinet where the neonatal team was still working carefully, placing a tiny oxygen mask over the baby's nose, his chest rising and falling weakly. Her lower lip trembled. "I didn't give birth to him," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I had to take care of him, because no one else would." Dr. Carter's brows knitted together. Who was supposed to take care of him? Naomi swallowed hard. "My sister." Margaret and Dr. Carter exchanged a quick glance. "Sister," Margaret repeated. Naomi nodded, her fingers curling into the sleeves of her hoodie. "My older sister, Elena." She hesitated, then added in a shaky voice, "She's gone now." A heavy silence settled over the room. Dr. Carter kept her voice steady. "Gone? What do you mean, Naomi?" Tears welled up in Naomi's eyes, but she blinked them away furiously. "I don't know exactly," she admitted. She was pregnant. She tried to hide it. She was only 16, and she was scared. She told me not to tell anyone, not even our mom. Naomi's breath hitched. "I promised her I wouldn't." Margaret placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder, silently encouraging her to go on. Naomi took a shaky breath. "She left home a few days ago. She said she'd be back, but she never came back." Her voice broke. "Then last night, I woke up and found the baby outside our apartment building, wrapped up in a basket. There was no note. Nothing. Just him." Dr. Carter exhaled slowly, absorbing the weight of Naomi's words. "Elena abandoned him?" Margaret asked softly. Naomi's shoulders stiffened. "No." Her voice was firm this time, desperate. "She wouldn't do that. She loved him. I know she did. Something happened to her." Dr. Carter nodded, keeping her face neutral. "Where are your parents, Naomi?" Naomi hesitated again, looking down. "Our mom. She's not around much. She works late. And when she's home, Naomi clenched her jaw, stopping herself from saying more. Dr. Carter didn't press. She had seen enough cases like this to understand the gaps in Naomi's story. "What about your dad?" Naomi shook her head. "He left a long time ago. It's just me and my mom now. And Elena." A fresh wave of tears threatened to spill over. "At least, it was." Dr. Carter let out a slow breath. "Naomi, did you see Elena at all before you found the baby?" Naomi hesitated. "No," she admitted, "but I heard something." Margaret leaned in. "What did you hear?" Naomi's lips parted, her breathing shallow. "I heard voices outside my window, really late at night. A man and a woman. I think it was Elena." And then the voices just stopped. Margaret's stomach twisted. Dr. Carter kept her tone even. "Did you look outside?" Naomi nodded slowly. "I saw a car driving away. A dark car. I don't know what kind." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "And then you found the baby?" Naomi nodded. "I ran downstairs, and there he was. Alone. Crying. I waited all night, thinking maybe she'd come back. But she never did." Dr. Carter sighed softly, glancing toward the bassinet. The baby's breathing had stabilized slightly, but he was still far from safe. Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. "Naomi, I believe you. But we need to find Elena. Do you have any idea where she might have gone? Any friends? Anywhere she used to stay?" Naomi chewed her lip. "Maybe. There's this old place she used to go when she didn't want to be home. An abandoned house a few blocks away. She called it her hiding place." Margaret nodded. "That's a good start." She turned to Dr. Carter. "We should call the authorities." Naomi tensed. "No." Margaret frowned. "Sweetheart, I know you're scared, but we need help finding Elena." Naomi shook her head violently. "You don't understand. If they think she abandoned the baby, they'll take him away. They'll take me away too." Dr. Carter's face softened. "Naomi, we just want to help. Right now, the most important thing is keeping both you and the baby safe." Naomi bit her lip so hard it turned white. "Please," she whispered, "don't let them take him." Margaret's chest ached. This girl had spent the entire night alone, keeping a fragile newborn alive, and now she was terrified of losing him. Dr. Carter reached out, gently squeezing Naomi's hands. "I promise you, we will do everything we can to keep him safe. But we also need to make sure you're safe too. You don't have to do this alone." Naomi hesitated, then gave a tiny, reluctant nod. Margaret reached for the phone. "I'll call the authorities, But let's make sure they understand. This isn't just an abandoned baby case. This is a missing person case too. Dr. Carter nodded. And we're going to find out what happened to Alina. Naomi swallowed hard, her fingers still trembling. She looked over at the tiny baby, his fragile chest rising and falling steadily. She had saved him once, and she would do whatever it took to protect him again. Shadows of the past. The air in the examination room felt heavier now. The beeping monitors and hushed conversations of the neonatal team provided a steady backdrop, but Naomi barely heard them. All she could focus on was the tiny, fragile form in the bassinet, the baby she had fought to protect all night. She clenched her hands into fists. Alina wouldn't have just abandoned him. She wouldn't. Dr. Carter had stepped outside to speak with hospital security and law enforcement, leaving Naomi with Margaret, who sat beside her, her presence gentle but firm. Margaret studied the girl's face. There was something in Naomi's eyes, beyond fear, beyond sadness, a quiet, burning determination. "Naomi," she said softly, "I need to ask you something important." Naomi sniffled and wiped her face with her hoodie sleeve. "What?" Margaret hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "Has your sister ever mentioned anyone? Someone who might want to hurt her?" Naomi's fingers tightened around the sleeves of her hoodie. I don't know." She swallowed hard. "There was someone. A man. She never told me his name, but she was scared of him." Margaret's heart sank. "What did she say about him?" Naomi bit her lip. "She just said she messed up, that she owed him something, but she never told me what." Margaret exhaled slowly. This is more than just a runaway teenager. Before she could say more, Dr. Carter returned, followed closely by a tall man in a dark suit. His sharp eyes scanned the room before settling on Naomi. "This is Detective Harris," Dr. Carter said gently. "He wants to help us find Alina." Naomi tensed immediately. Detective Harris crouched slightly, bringing himself to her level. His voice was calm but firm. "Naomi, I know you're scared, but your sister could be in real danger. Anything you tell me might help us find her." Naomi hesitated, glancing at Margaret, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. After a long pause, she whispered, "She talked about a man." Harris' expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. "Do you know his name?" Naomi shook her head. "What did she say about him?" Naomi hesitated, then said, "She was afraid of him. She said she owed him something. I don't know what. She wouldn't tell me." Harris nodded. "Did she ever mention where she met him?" Naomi thought for a moment. "She used to go out late sometimes. I think she met him at a bar, the one near our apartment complex, the Silver Lantern." Margaret felt her stomach twist. That was no place for a 16-year-old girl. Harris's expression darkened slightly. "That's helpful. I'll check it out." He stood up. "Do you remember anything else? Anything she said before she left?" Naomi hesitated, then whispered, "She said she was going to fix everything." Margaret's chest ached at the quiet heartbreak in Naomi's voice. Harris nodded, scribbling something in his notepad. Then, with a final glance at the fragile baby in the bassinet, he turned to leave. "I'll let you know what we find." A mother's silence. After Harris left, the room felt colder. Margaret sighed, glancing at Naomi. "Sweetheart, I need to ask you something else." Naomi looked up, her eyes wary. Margaret hesitated. "Your mother. Does she know about the baby?" Naomi's hands clenched. "She doesn't care," she muttered. Margaret frowned. "Naomi, does she know about Alina being missing?" Naomi's lips pressed together in a thin, angry line. "She doesn't care about that either." Margaret exchanged a glance with Dr. Carter. "Has she hurt you before?" Dr. Carter asked gently. Naomi looked away. "She's not like that," she mumbled. "She just doesn't notice things. She never noticed when Alina started coming home late. She never noticed when she stopped eating. She never noticed when she left." Margaret's heart ached. These girls had been on their own for a long time. Dr. Carter sighed. rubbing her temples. Naomi, I think we need to talk to your mother. Naomi's jaw tightened. She won't help. Margaret's voice was soft but firm. Maybe not. But we need to try. A fractured home. Later that afternoon, Margaret drove Naomi back to her apartment complex. The building was old, the paint peeling, the entrance littered with cigarette butts and discarded flyers. Naomi led her inside reluctantly, her small frame tense. The apartment was silent when they entered. A woman sat on the couch, her tired eyes barely registering their arrival. She was thin, her face lined with exhaustion, a half-empty bottle of beer sitting beside her on the coffee table. Margaret swallowed hard. No wonder Naomi and Alina had been on their own. Naomi's mother barely looked up. What do you want? Margaret took a steady breath. Ms. Daniels, your daughter Alina is missing. The woman blinked. Alina? Naomi's fists clenched at her sides. She's been gone for days, Mom. Ms. Daniels frowned, rubbing her temples. She'll come back. Margaret's stomach twisted. Ms. Daniels, we need to take this seriously. A newborn baby was left outside your apartment. That got her attention. Her head snapped up. A baby? Margaret nodded. Naomi brought him to the hospital. We're trying to figure out what happened. Ms. Daniels let out a short, bitter laugh. That girl, always getting into trouble. Naomi's face burned with anger. She's in trouble now, Mom, she snapped. Ms. Daniels exhaled slowly. I don't know where she is. She stopped talking to me months ago. Margaret could tell the woman wasn't lying, just indifferent. Dr. Carter sighed. Ms. Daniels, if Alina was in danger, would you even know? The woman didn't answer. Naomi's voice was raw. She wouldn't. She never cared. Ms. Daniels looked away. Margaret's chest ached. Naomi was right. They had been alone all along. A clue in the dark. Back at the hospital, Detective Harris called with an update. The Silver Lantern's owner recognized Alina, he said. She was there a few nights ago, and she wasn't alone. Margaret's breath caught. Who was she with? Harris sighed. A man named Victor Moreno. He has a history of bad dealings. Alina was seen arguing with him that night. Margaret's stomach twisted. Do we know where he is now? There was a pause. We're working on it, Harris admitted. But here's the thing. Alina was last seen getting into his car. A dark sit-in. Margaret's blood ran cold. A dark car. Naomi's words echoed in her mind. I saw a dark car driving away. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. Alina hadn't left willingly. And now, time was running out. A race against time. Margaret's grip tightened around her phone as Detective Harris' words sank in. Alina had gotten into a dark sit-in. The same kind of car Naomi had seen driving away the night she found the baby. This wasn't just a runaway case anymore. This was an abduction. Margaret turned to Naomi, who had been sitting quietly, her eyes dark with worry. Naomi, she said carefully, I need you to tell me everything you remember about that night. Naomi swallowed, her hands tightening into fists in her lap. I already told you everything. I know, Margaret said gently. But even the smallest detail could help. Did you hear anything before the voices stopped? Any names? Naomi hesitated, her brows furrowing. I don't know. It was late. I was half asleep, but I think she screamed. Margaret's stomach twisted. Naomi's voice became even quieter. It wasn't a long scream. Just like she was surprised. And then it was silent. Dr. Carter, who had been listening, exhaled slowly. She didn't run away, she said softly. She was taken. Margaret nodded, which means we need to find her. Fast. Naomi's hands trembled. What if something bad already happened? Margaret crouched in front of her, placing a reassuring hand over Naomi's. Then we're going to stop it from getting worse. Naomi's lips quivered. I don't want to lose her. Margaret squeezed her hand. Neither do we. The man in the shadows. Detective Harris wasted no time. He pulled up Victor Moreno's criminal record: fraud, illegal gambling, and suspected involvement in human trafficking. But there was something else. A past connection to the Silver Lantern. Harris pulled up security footage from nearby street cameras. It was grainy, but there, a black sedan pulling up outside the bar 2 nights ago. A girl matching Elena's description hesitated at the entrance. A man stepped out of the car, speaking to her. She looked uncertain, glancing around. Then, after a moment of hesitation, she got into the car. The sedan drove off. Harris clenched his jaw. This wasn't a coincidence. He called Margaret immediately. "We found footage of her leaving with Moreno," he said. "We traced his car's plates to a warehouse district just outside of town. We're heading there now." Margaret's breath caught. "Do you think she's still alive?" Harris hesitated. "We have to hope." A desperate search. Margaret didn't tell Naomi about the warehouse immediately. She didn't want to raise her hopes too soon. But Naomi was too smart for that. "You know something," she said, watching Margaret closely. Margaret hesitated, then sighed. "The police found out where the man took her." Naomi's eyes widened. "Then we have to go." Margaret shook her head. "The police are handling it." Naomi jumped up, her breath ragged. "No, you don't understand. What if they don't make it in time? What if?" Margaret knelt in front of her, gripping her shoulders gently. "Naomi, listen to me." The girl's eyes were wild, desperate. "We will find her," Margaret promised. "But you need to trust the police." Naomi swallowed hard. I just want her back." Margaret's heart clenched. "I know." The warehouse. Detective Harris and his team arrived at the warehouse just after sunset. The place was mostly abandoned: old storage units, rusted metal doors, and shattered windows covered in graffiti. But Moreno's car was there. Harris signaled to his team. "Move in carefully." They approached the building, weapons drawn, flashlights cutting through the darkness. A noise. A muffled sound, coming from inside. Harris signaled, and one of the officers kicked open the rusted door. The smell of mildew and gasoline filled the air. And there, tied to a chair, her wrists bound, her face bruised, was Elena. Her eyes widened in shock as the officers rushed in. "Help!" Harris sprinted forward, cutting the ropes binding her. "Elena Daniels," she sobbed, nodding frantically. "Yes, please. Where's my baby?" Harris glanced at his team. "She's safe. Your sister saved him." Elena choked out a cry of relief. "Naomi." Footsteps pounded behind them. "Move, move," an officer shouted. Moreno had been inside. He tried to escape out the back, but the police were faster. He was tackled to the ground, handcuffed in seconds. Harris turned to Elena. "You're safe now." Elena's lip quivered. "Take me to my baby." A reunion. Back at the hospital, Naomi had barely moved. She sat beside the bassinet, watching over the baby like a guardian angel. Margaret had stayed with her, waiting for news. Then, at last, it came. The door opened, and Detective Harris stepped in. Naomi jumped to her feet. "Did you?" And then she saw her. Elena stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes full of tears. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Naomi let out a broken cry and ran forward. Elena dropped to her knees, pulling her little sister into a desperate embrace. "I thought I lost you," Naomi whispered. Elena sobbed, holding her tight. "I'm so sorry. I never meant to leave you." Margaret wiped her eyes, swallowing the lump in her throat. Then Elena's gaze lifted, falling on the bassinet. She stood, her legs shaky, and approached slowly. The baby lay there, breathing steadily now, his tiny fingers curled against his chest. Elena reached out with trembling hands, her fingers brushing over his soft skin. "He's okay," Margaret said softly. "Because of Naomi." Elena turned back to her sister, fresh tears in her eyes. You saved him. Naomi sniffled. I couldn't let him be alone. Elena pulled her into another tight hug. I love you so much. Margaret watched as the sisters held each other, and for the first time since the ordeal began, she saw something new in Naomi's eyes. Picking up the pieces, the hospital room was silent except for the steady beep of the baby's heart monitor. Naomi and Elena sat close, their fingers entwined, as if afraid that letting go would make everything crumble again. The baby slept soundly in the bassinet beside them, his tiny chest rising and falling in rhythmic peace. Margaret had stepped outside to give them privacy, but even through the closed door, she could feel the weight of everything they had endured. A lost sister, a stolen moment of freedom, a newborn left in the cold. And yet, despite it all, they had found their way back to each other. Naomi was the first to break the silence. I thought you were dead, she whispered, her fingers tightening around Elena's hand. Elena's throat constricted. I thought I was too. Naomi's face twisted, her small frame trembling. Why did you leave? Why didn't you tell me what was happening? Elena exhaled shakily, her eyes brimming with tears. Because I was ashamed. Because I was stupid. She glanced at the baby, then back at Naomi. I was trying to fix everything before it was too late. Naomi swallowed hard. I don't understand. Elena looked down at her lap. I met Victor Moreno months ago. I thought he was just another guy at the bar. I didn't know who he really was until it was too late. Naomi's stomach twisted. Elena's voice cracked. When I got pregnant, I was terrified. Mom didn't care. She barely noticed. But Moreno, he noticed. He told me I owed him. That if I wanted to survive, I had to do something for him. Naomi's voice barely rose above a whisper. What did he make you do? Elena hesitated, her fingers trembling. He wanted me to pay a debt I never knew I had. He said he gave me money, helped me when no one else would. I don't even remember when. Maybe it was the free drinks, the favors he did, the gifts I never asked for. It was all a trap. Naomi's blood ran cold. But you didn't do what he wanted, did you? Elena shook her head. No, I refused. That's when everything got worse. She looked away, her voice barely audible. The night before I disappeared, he came to my apartment. He told me I had one more chance, that if I didn't cooperate, I wouldn't get to keep my baby. Naomi's heart pounded. He tried to take him. Elena let out a broken sob. He was never supposed to be left outside. I had a plan. I was going to run, to disappear before Moreno could find me. But he caught me before I could get away. She swallowed hard. He took me to that warehouse. Told me I wasn't leaving until I agreed to work for him. Naomi's chest ached. And the baby. Elena closed her eyes. I think someone else left him outside our building. Maybe one of Moreno's guys. Or maybe. She hesitated, her voice shaking. Maybe someone had mercy on him. Naomi felt her nails dig into her palms. You didn't abandon him. Elena shook her head fiercely. Never. Tears welled up in Naomi's eyes. I knew it. Elena swallowed hard, her fingers brushing over the sleeping baby's tiny hand. I thought I'd never see him again. Naomi reached out and squeezed her hand. You have us now. We're not alone. Elena let out a shaky breath, nodding. Facing the consequences, outside the room, Margaret and Detective Harris spoke in hushed tones. We have Moreno in custody, Harris said, glancing at the report in his hands. But he's not talking. Margaret folded her arms. He knows we can't tie him directly to human trafficking unless we get a statement from Elena. Harris nodded grimly. And that's the problem. Elena is scared. She knows Moreno has connections. If she talks, she'll have a target on her back. Margaret sighed. But if she doesn't, how do we stop him? Harris rubbed his temples. We have enough to charge him with kidnapping and assault, but that won't put him away forever. Margaret frowned. There has to be another way. Just then, the door to the hospital room opened, and Elena stepped out. Her face was pale but determined. "I'll testify," she said. Harris and Margaret exchanged a surprised glance. "Elena," Margaret started carefully, "you don't have to do this alone. We can find another way." "No," Elena interrupted, shaking her head. "If I don't say something, he'll do this to someone else. He'll take more girls, more babies. I won't let that happen." Harris studied her for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "Okay." Elena let out a slow breath. "I just want to make sure my son is safe first," she whispered. Margaret smiled gently. "We'll protect him. And you." Elena nodded, a fresh wave of tears threatening to spill. She had been afraid for so long. But now, standing in the hospital hallway, she realized something. She wasn't afraid anymore. A new beginning. 2 days later, Naomi sat beside Elena in the hospital room, watching as her sister gently rocked the baby in her arms. "He needs a name," Naomi said softly. Elena smiled down at the infant, brushing a soft curl from his forehead. "I was thinking, maybe Daniel." Naomi tilted her head. "Why Daniel?" Elena's smile turned bittersweet. "Because it means God is my judge." Naomi felt warmth bloom in her chest. "Daniel," she repeated. "I like it." Elena glanced at her sister. "You saved him, you know." Naomi shrugged. "You saved him first." Elena's eyes softened. "We saved each other." Margaret watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with quiet relief. Elena had a long road ahead. Court proceedings, therapy, rebuilding the pieces of her life. But she wasn't alone anymore. She had Naomi. She had Daniel. And for the first time in a long time, she had hope. A future worth fighting for. The sun poured through the hospital window, casting golden light over the room. It had been a long, exhausting few days, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Naomi and Elena felt safe. The baby, Daniel, slept peacefully in Elena's arms, his tiny fingers curling and uncurling as if dreaming of the warmth he now had. Margaret stood by the doorway, watching them with a quiet smile. They had come so far, but their journey wasn't over yet. Naomi turned her gaze toward her sister, hesitating before she spoke. "What's going to happen now?" Elena let out a slow breath, shifting Daniel in her arms. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't have a job. I don't have a place of my own. And Mom isn't exactly the best person to go back to." Margaret stepped forward. "You won't have to go back to her if you don't want to." Naomi frowned. "Where else would we go?" Elena bit her lip. "Social services will probably get involved. They might try to take Daniel from me." The word sent a jolt of fear through Naomi. "No, you're his mom. You love him." "I know," Elena whispered, her voice shaking. "But love isn't always enough in their eyes." Margaret knelt beside her. "Listen to me, Elena. You've been through a lot, but you've shown incredible strength. If you fight for Daniel, if you show that you can take care of him, they won't take him away." Elena swallowed hard. "But how? I have nothing." Margaret smiled softly. "That's not true. You have Naomi. You have people who care about you, and you have a chance to start over." Elena's eyes glistened with tears. "I just don't know where to start." Margaret squeezed her hand. "One step at a time." An unexpected offer. Later that afternoon, Detective Harris stopped by the hospital. He carried a file in his hand and a look of quiet determination on his face. "We got Moreno," he said, setting the file down on the table. "Elena's testimony sealed the deal. He's facing charges for kidnapping, extortion, and attempted human trafficking. He won't be seeing the outside of a prison cell for a long time." Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Naomi clenched her fists. "So he can't hurt her anymore?" Harris shook his head. "No, he's done." Elena's lips trembled. "Good." Harris studied her carefully. "I also spoke to a social worker on your behalf. Given everything you've been through, they're willing to offer you help instead of taking Daniel away. if you're willing to accept it. Alina's heart pounded. What kind of help? A program for young mothers, Harris explained. They provide housing, job training, and child care support while you get on your feet. It won't be easy, but it's a second chance. Alina stared at him, disbelief washing over her. And they'd let me keep my baby. Harris nodded. Yes, as long as you're willing to fight for him. A tear slipped down Alina's cheek. I'll fight. I'll do whatever it takes. Naomi grabbed her hand, squeezing it tightly. We'll do it together. A new home. A week later, Naomi and Alina stood outside a small but clean apartment complex. The social workers had arranged a place for them to stay while Alina started her journey to independence. Margaret helped them carry their bags inside, and as they stepped into their new home, it finally hit them. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were starting over. The apartment was modest but cozy. A small kitchen, a living room with second-hand furniture, and a tiny bedroom with a crib for Daniel. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Alina stood in the center of the room, holding Daniel close. This is real, she whispered. Naomi grinned. Yeah, it is. Margaret placed a gentle hand on Alina's shoulder. You did this. You fought for him. For yourself. That's what matters. Alina turned to Naomi. I wouldn't have made it without you. Naomi shook her head. We saved each other. Margaret smiled. And now it's time to build something new. Alina took a deep breath, looking around the room. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of the future. She was ready for it. Epilogue. A future worth fighting for months passed, and life slowly began to settle. Alina found a job at a small cafe, working mornings so she could take care of Daniel in the afternoons. She was tired, but she was free. Naomi started school again. For the first time, she didn't have to worry about coming home to an empty apartment. Daniel grew stronger, healthier, his laughter filling their small home with warmth. One evening, as they sat together on their tiny couch, Alina turned to Naomi with a soft smile. We made it, she whispered. Naomi grinned. Yeah, we did. Their past hadn't been easy. Their journey wasn't over. But for the first time in a long time, they had hope. And that was enough.